Okay, so it's 4 o'clock and I'd like to get started. My name is Lisa Onaga. I'm one of the co-coordinators of this year's Institute Colloquium along with Stephanie Hood. I'd like to welcome you all back to our October session. I hope everyone can hear me. Just nod if you can, if it's all right with you. Great. And so our topic of this year's series is Crisis and Capacity, Perspectives in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And what we're doing this academic year, we're highlighting various scholars within and in relation to the history of science to collectively reflect on what the pandemic means for doing research right here, right now, in Germany, in Europe, around the world. And it's especially pertinent now, given that we are seeing once again rising infection rates locally. And today's theme is, what does race have to do with the history of science? So to give you a little bit of background to this, relatedly, in the summer here at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science, we had a listening and sharing session about anti-racism. And there were some developments in the wake of this. And before we begin with the rest of today's program, I would like to invite Rebecca Eilfort to give a special announcement about this. And there is a little slide that I need to share with you that goes with her talk. So just for 2 minutes, Rebecca.
Hi. I just wanted to briefly update you on the anti-racism efforts within the MPIWG and invite you to participate. As Lisa just said, we had an MPIWG-wide listening and sharing session that was held in July to discuss racism and discrimination at the Institute. Staff, students, and scholars from across the MPIWG contributed in the session and anonymously on the Etherpad. The discussion points and suggestions were summarized and compiled by a smaller group and then submitted to the Institute's leadership in September. You can find the document on the Institute's cloud. Now that is done, a new collective group will be established in order to discuss the next steps and further actions. It is open to all, and I invite everyone to join the first meeting on October 27th at 9 a.m. via Zoom, or to share comments and questions anonymously via an Etherpad. There's no need to write down any links or anything. You'll receive an email with the relevant information. I thank you guys for making this available and for listening to me, and I hope to see you all October 27th, and now I'm really looking forward to the colloquium.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca, and for all of the people involved in making a space, a convivial space for talking about these things and making some further actions. So what I would like to do now is tell you a bit about the format for today. I'm going to introduce each speaker, who will be talking for 20 minutes in a micro lecture format. And then the 2 speakers will address one another and have a conversation. And you'll be privy to hearing how they connect with each other and how they find synergies, contrasts, and so on, and how they're thinking through their own materials with one another. And then we'll open up the floor to question and answer, where we can get involved as historians of science, technology, and medicine in the environment to think together. Not all of us work on history of race, but we can think about, what does race have to do with the history of science, whether that has to do with some content about race and its history, or race science, or has something to do with institutional aspects thereof. So the question and answer session will be moderated by Stephanie Hood. And you'll notice in the chat window that there is an Etherpad link, and you can queue up there for questions. You can simply write your name down. And you can also write questions in anonymously, or write some comments or reflections or if you feel really moved for some reason, please go ahead and write that down, and you'll be anonymous so long as you don't put your name into the document. And in the Etherpad, there are also useful links as well to the Institute's Colloquium Internet Library Corner. This is a new endeavor that we are undertaking, given that our meetings, speaking of conviviality, are all virtual. So the library has been so kind as to help us set up an internet corner where you can go to this link and read all of the, or as many of as possible, the papers of the speakers at your leisure. So please do check that out. It's a really special feature, and we thank the library for this. And we also thank the library for making a physical library corner that features our two speakers and the speakers of the past and coming up. And I should just mention that we are going to have our next Institute's Colloquium speaker visit us in November. We have, well, we'll furnish the whole lineup shortly, but one of our speakers will be Evelyn Hammonds from Harvard University. So she'll be talking to us about HIV/AIDS epidemics. Okay, so I hope I haven't forgotten any other household issues, but so I would like to then introduce our first speaker today. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Tiffany Florvil, who is an associate professor of 20th century European women's and gender history at the University of New Mexico. Her career, in a sense, began when she decided at the age of 18 to leave Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to learn everything she could about Germany and German language. So she was awarded a Congress Bundestag scholarship and enrolled in the Heisenberg Gymnasium in Hamburg. And she's dedicated her career to the study of histories of post-1945 Europe, the African and Black diaspora, social movements, feminism, Black internationalism, gender and sexuality and emotions, building on her training in history, German literature, and gender and women's studies at Florida State University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and University of South Carolina. She's held numerous fellowships, not only from the DAAD, but the American Council on Germany. And these have brought her back to Berlin repeatedly, not too far from where we are, in fact, over the years toward the completion of her book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of a Transnational Movement with University of Illinois Press. And many of her articles and edited volumes, including Rethinking Black German Studies, Approaches, Interventions, and Histories, are on the Internet Library Corner. So please check that out. And also check out the podcast interview with Enda Bonhomme that was also circulated, I think, around the same time last week or so, following the emails advertising this talk today. So Professor Florvil, just to sum up, is an award-winning teacher whose writing appears in public venues like Black Perspectives and historianspeaks.org, and she has an active presence in the digital humanities. I need to mention this. She's a co-founder of H Black Europe Group and the H Emotions Studies Group on HNet. We all look at HNet, but it's nice to meet somebody who actually has had a hand in forming that online community. And these reflect her keen interest in the practice of how effective communities are produced, how they stick together, and how they create meanings of the world. So I'm particularly interested in this forthcoming volume, Innovations in Black European Studies with Peter Lang Press, and that's due out in 2021. But today, her micro-lecture, Black German Intellectual Activism in the Past and Present, will be about the epistemic moment that was at the heart of a larger Black German movement in the 80s and 90s. And that's part of the book, which is coming out in December. And note, there's a discount code for it that's also on the Internet Library Corner page. So I'm pushing the library corner right now. And we can look at that and understand why we need to understand all of this history in order to make sense of the intertwined natures of COVID-19, the pandemic, and the Black Lives Matter movement. So without further ado, thank you for joining us today, Professor Florvil.
Thanks, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. I just want to also thank both Lisa and Steph, as well as Jan, for helping to organize this event and this sort of series. I'm very, very honored to be here with you guys today. And as Lisa mentioned, I'm sort of presenting a few things from my forthcoming book. These are sort of ideas about affect, more so sort of intellectualism, sort of rethinking what intellectualism can look like in epistemic moments. And then also just thinking about the significance of racial, anti-racist activism more broadly. So without further ado, I'm just gonna sort of go right into it. 2020 has unveiled a double pandemic that has not only had an impact in the United States, but across the globe. The first pandemic is, of course, racism. The slave trade and colonialism, among other developments, imbued racism with meaning and granted it power in the everyday. Racism has caused profound material effects and normalized structures of inequality and indifference at all levels in society. This pandemic has disproportionately killed African American, Latinx, Indigenous, and other people of color long before COVID-19 came along to make this much more visible and intelligible for some. Mark Duggan, Christy Schwendeck, Breonna Taylor, and countless others represent its body count in Europe and the United States. The second pandemic is COVID, and we've witnessed its devastation in African American, Latinx, and Indigenous communities in the US, as well as in Black and Asian communities in Britain. COVID has exposed the existence of stark inequalities on both sides of the Atlantic. Striking is that both pandemics are viral, affecting the healthy body system and body politic, and causing injuries and harm that can and do lead to death. Racism is in itself a deep-rooted disease that has shifted across space and time. Historian Thomas Holt has written that, and I quote, "As for the thing itself, racism's powerful hold, its tenaciousness, it appears to arise not from some parasitic attachment on the surface of an otherwise healthy body politic, but from viral growths within the living whole. Race yet lives because it is part and parcel of the means of living," end quote. Theorist Frantz Fanon also recognized the importance of embodiment in his 1952 Black Skin, White Masks, where he psychoanalyzed race and how the skin was a site for racial oppression and produced internalized inferiority. Other Black diasporic figures have theorized about the character and causes of racism, and they recognized they othered and destroyed the Black subject at the same time that it harmed the national body. The recent protests in this moment continue to shed light on racism and the afterlives of colonialism in Europe, the United States, and other regions. As activists, intellectuals in Germany and Belgium and other countries affirm that Black lives matter, they offer the latest expressions of liberatory politics. They push for meaningful anti-racist reform. These activist intellectuals also agitated for systemic change, holding their governments and communities accountable while also rejecting platitudes, inaction, and silence. As a white Minnesota police officer knelt on George Floyd's neck for nearly 8 minutes, there's been also a discrepancy, sort of a follow-up that it was actually sort of 8 minutes instead of 9 minutes, but in any case, it happened. The reverberations of dissent and protest abounded worldwide. The moment of layered discontent and eloquent rage demonstrates how Black freedom struggles in the United States resonate and elicit strong, effective political and cultural responses abroad. Reactions to Floyd's death reflected the interplay of local and global phenomena. These developments reveal the ingrained nature of racial, gendered, and class hierarchies in which state, ethno-nationalists, and other forms of violence persist. Yet there have been previous moments to demand anti-discriminatory changes throughout Europe, particularly in Germany. This paper maintains that these current and anti-racist moments for equality, especially Black Lives Matter in Germany, have earlier precedents. In fact, earlier modes of political mobilization occurred in the German metropole and in its colonies, in which African-descended people decried racism and advocated for human rights. And of course, I wrote a little bit about these connections in an APUZ article that was recently published this month. So I talk about this sort of larger lineage of anti-racist activism in the 20th century in Germany. But I particularly want to draw your attention to previous examples of anti-racist activism in the late 20th century, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. It was during those years that the modern Black German movement emerged and led to new diasporic forms of activism in West Germany. As a result of the labor of activist intellectuals such as Maya Im, Katrin Oguntoya, Nii Adi, and others, the movement engendered cultural productions that push for recognition and representation in the German nation and beyond by forging effective communities. As an effective community, a term that I borrow from scholar Leila Gandhi, they shared collective forms of feeling and meaning about the world, allowing them to cohere at the local and national levels, much like what we witness again today. Opening up spaces for intellectualism, I argue that Black Germans became quotidian intellectuals who imparted different kinds of knowledge about various mediums, that brought the everyday to the fore. And here I'm thinking about spoken word poetry, art installations, conferences, etc. They represented the quotidian by examining the significance of everyday discriminatory practices, policies, and discourses. The quotidian also had transnational reverberations. Black Germans' efforts at social mobilization exposed racial inequity and challenged their erasure from the nation. Moreover, their work shed light on German cultural and political crises that arose due to a confluence of events, including the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the political unification of the Germanys, the consolidation of the European Union, and the hardening of European borders, with the latter two developments leading to a fortress Europe. Throughout the movement, Black Germans' productions and dissemination of knowledge was a source of power and solidarity, and undercut dominant knowledge and negative representations of Germany's Black diaspora. By doing so, they redefined intellectuals and the shape of intellectual work, creating epistemic interventions that expanded the notions of politics, intellectualism, and science. The modern Black German movement led to an effective and cultural movement that made Black Germans feel like a part of the diaspora and proved that they were political protagonists on their own terms. Black German political protagonists pursued grassroots mobilization and instigated change. Their bold act of self-definition and curation no longer allowed derogatory and racist German labels to dictate who they were and what they could achieve. As a result, Black Germans created a new lexicon with the designations of Afro-Germans, Afrodeutsche, and Black Germans, Schwarze Deutsche. These concepts offered a new forms of knowledge that disrupted the fixity and hegemony of German identity as based on whiteness alone. They also practiced sociologist Edward Bonilla Silva's concept of a racial grammar, noting how this grammar influenced vision, emotion, and their sense of aesthetics, in addition to the way that Germans talk about and frame racial matters. They instantiated their effective community through language, shifting normative ways of knowing. Oguntoya and Naim also recognized that Germany's social organization centered on their exclusion and difference and signified unequal power relations among federal and state institutions, Black Germans, and other people of color, migrants, as well as their white German counterparts. Naim and Oguntoya's efforts unsettled and contested these power dynamics. Their empowering language was an epistemic intervention that enabled Black Germans to enter the public sphere on their own terms. Historically, African-descended peoples were either included in the public sphere in degrading ways, such as the Volksschau or People's Show or Human Zoo tradition, or in hypersexualized imagery. African-descended peoples were also excluded from the public sphere because they were considered to be what historian Andrew Zimmerman has referred to as natural peoples, individuals allegedly lacking history and culture and presumed to be inferior to European cultural peoples. Moreover, white Germans practiced what historian Morris Ede has called an Afro-Americophilia that involved the appropriation, exotization, and celebration of African American culture. As a result of this common practice, some white Germans tended to accept and celebrate Black diasporic writers like Toni Morrison or Alice Walker, who were routed to but not rooted in the nation. Therefore, this Black German coming out empowered Black Germans after enduring years of invisibility, loneliness, and powerlessness in a majority white German society. Black German quotidian intellectuals understood how intertwined language, power, and resistance were individually and collectively. In addition to the creation of a new vocabulary, they also established two cultural political organizations, ISD, or the Initiative of Black Germans, Initiative of Schwarze Deutsche in 1985, and ADEFRA, or Afro-German Women, Afro-Deutsche Frauen, in 1986, that continued to offer epistemic interventions. ISD arranged consciousness-raising workshops, social gatherings, and anti-discrimination protests. ADEFRA, the sister organization of ISD, focused on anti-racist, feminist, and gender themes and hosted retreats, seminars, and conferences. All of these events disseminated knowledge that often addressed entrenched issues of racism in Germany and the global diaspora. Local chapters for both organizations grew in West German cities and later in former East German cities. For many, the movement's origins are linked to Caribbean-American poet and activist Audre Lorde, who was a visiting professor at the Free University of Berlin in 1984. At the FU, she taught 3 literature courses. Black German women Katharina Oguntoya and Maya Im attended those courses and connected with Lorde, one another, and others. Her classes, public readings, and other events across Germany enabled Black Germans to forge diasporic connections with one another, and these women and others felt empowered to organize and write. With Lorde's encouragement, Aim and Oguntoya published Farbekennen, Afro-Deutsche Frauen auf den Spuren ihrer Geschichte, in 1986 by the feminist press Yolonda Verlag. White German and feminist Dagmar Schultz, the owner of Yolonda Verlag, also co-edited the volume. After 1984, Lorde continued to return to Germany until her last visit in September 1992. A few months later, she succumbed to liver cancer in St. Croix. Lorde has certainly maintained a symbolic significance to Black Germans in the movement, in which many have labeled her the godmother of the movement. But there are some who find Lorde's lionization problematic and not necessarily representative of all Black Germans. In Farbekennen, Aim and Oguntoya eschewed traditional approaches by mixing genres and writing styles. Their use of poetry, historical articles, and autobiographical essays helped them produce new racial and gendered knowledge. Traveling across West Germany, they conducted interviews with multi-generational Black German women and research that traced the presence of people of African descent in Germany. The foundation of the volume's research came from Maya Im's thesis and Oguntoya's interviews. Both women's power functioned through their production and circulation of new ideas about Germany's Black diaspora, challenging the notion of a Germany without Blackness. They also constructed new spaces, figuratively and literally, that enabled Black Germans to articulate claims of inclusion within the nation. The volume reimagined the parameters of Blackness and womanhood across different space-times. It also rehabilitated multi-generational Black German womanhood, disrupting widespread images that continually reproduce stereotypical ideas about Black women. And here I'm thinking about sort of media portrayals of Black people also more broadly, that this book helps to sort of really not only sort of disrupt, but challenge and sort of subvert the white gaze in many ways. In the process, Farbekennen embodied Black German women's thoughts, theories, and knowledge. This feminist and diasporic test also afforded Black Germans with an opportunity for visibility and recognition, not only through the word of mouth and public readings across Germany, but also internationally in published reviews and of the volume and at Global South and feminist conferences. From Farbekennen to her later PhD work in education, Maya Im in particular transmitted knowledge and divide a German epistemic tradition that often included men like Hegel. Of course, Hegel believed that the African other, lacked a history and the ability to reason because they were quote unquote children, and that Africans could not attain civilization or progress, remaining outside of Europe's borders. Im's poetry and prose established her ability to reason and think philosophically, and her literature located and placed the Black subject within the German nation and the European continent more broadly. Her uncovering of the history of Black Germans predated the post-World War II period. She, along with others in both ISD and ADEFRA, also outlined Black Germans' daily struggles that entailed verbal, physical, and visual racial abuse. During and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, she recognized that the reemergence of intolerance in society intersected with other dynamics across the world and highlighted the significance of examples of everyday discrimination in global contexts. Moreover, in her dissertation, Aim expanded our understanding of the reach of science through her study of the entrenched role of racism and Eurocentrism in speech therapy. While speech therapy may be considered a soft science, it's here, as with her previous work, where she showed the impact of racism and sexism that were normalized in the German language. Those speech patterns are inculcated, leading Black Germans and other Germans of color to often internalize their otherness and exacerbate pre-existing speech disorders. Here, too, she unpacked the connection between science and society, illustrating its lack of objectivity in ways that remain relevant in this contemporary moment. In addition to Aim, other members in the larger Black German community, such as John Cantata, Abina Adamako, Mike Reichel, organized a variety of events that represented the interplay of knowledge and power. At the 1985 National Meeting of Black Germans, in Wiesbaden, which sparked the movement, Black Germans share their effective knowledge. Exchanging their mutual experiences of exclusion, isolation, and frustration, they also found strength in forging kinships. Black Germans also acquired power through seeing, hearing, and understanding their Blackness did in fact have a place in Germany. The meeting helped many embrace their Black Germanness and feel Black German. This initial meeting also started a tradition of the national meeting, or Bundestreffen, which takes place annually to this day. These events were for Black Germans and other individuals of the Black diaspora. In my forthcoming manuscript, I argue that these national meetings exemplified Black Germans' construction and maintenance of Black geographies away from the white gaze. Yet these meetings, much like subsequent Black German organizational events, also served as sites for the production and dissemination of knowledge. They addressed topics like German racism and colonialism and their impact on Black subjects that continued to be ignored in mainstream discourses and debates. Black Germans organized political workshops, seminars, poetry readings, and other events to not only unify and socialize with each other, but to also offer sites for intellectual exchange and edification. These events engendered new sites for intellectualism and positioned Black Germans as quotidian intellectuals. And of course, I can talk about this concept of quotidian intellectuals a little bit more in the Q&A if you'd like. Through their movement, Black Germans confronted a discursive power that made and remade their otherness. Black Germans rendered multiple sites visible for Black thought and action in Germany. They continue these intellectual and cultural practices with their annual Black History Month celebrations in Berlin. Developed by Black Germans Danny Hatke, Roy Weichert, Michael Reichel, and African-American Patricia Elcock in February 1990, the Black History Month events, which grew out of ISD's cultural group, focused on international themes, including colonialism, civil wars in Africa, diasporic resistance movements, and much more. Acknowledging transnational connections, Black Germans and other diasporic organizers referred to Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black history in the United States, in the Black History Month programs. Woodson first established Black History Week in 1926 in the United States. At the first Black History Month event, nearly all the sessions explored Black internationalist themes, including cultural riches in Africa and the history of slavery. That same year, members from other ISD and ADEFRA chapters helped to arrange a program that included screenings of 14 South African films that shed light on the country's history, politics, and culture. The Black History Month events facilitated the academic study of Black history, furthering the field of Black German studies, along with supporting public outreach. Black Germans remained attentive to translocal currents in Berlin, such as increased racial violence against immigrants and people of color on the streets at the hands of neo-Nazis, or daily micro and macro aggressions in society. This overlapped with transnational currents in France, South Africa, and elsewhere. As quotidian intellectuals, they theorized, shaped, and communicated ideas on a variety of topics that dealt with Africa and its diaspora. And they produced knowledge about the impact of marginalization at home and abroad, debunking racist stereotypes and presumptions in Germany. ISD maintained collaborative partnerships with local groups and campaigned on global issues such as civil unrest and inequality throughout the African continent, as well as opposition to conservative European politicians such as National Front leader at the time, Jean-Marie Le Pen. Black Germans blended discussions on discourses about the daily, national, and international currents of racism, along with critical issues of migration, whiteness, and intersectionality across Europe and Africa. And this, of course, reflected their ability to bridge the academic with everyday intellectualism. In some of these instances, Black History Month events had not even been considered or adopted in mainstream circles. So rather than recapitulate the main points in my paper again, I want to draw attention to why my discussion of Black German mobilization is significant. First, it shows how Black German effective communities cohere and advocated for anti-racist reforms within and beyond the nation. Of course, in this way, emotions serve as a form of kinship, allowing people to to obtain a variety of not only effective connections, but also effective power to sort of instigate change. Second, my discussion also recasts politics and intellectualism in new ways. With the establishment of ISD and ADEFRA and the planning of organizational events in Berlin, Frankfurt, and other cities across Germany, Black Germans opened up new spaces for knowledge production and circulation in the land of Dichte and Denke. As quotidian intellectuals, they stressed the everyday nature of racist practices locally, nationally, and internationally. They also reclaimed their agental voices through poetry, seminars, and conferences, challenging their erasure from the national polity. In essence, they reimagined the appearance of intellectuals and the form of intellectualism. In doing so, they affirmed that the intellectual, political, and culture were always intertwined and that knowledge and power were attainable. Indeed, they proved that Black lives matter in the past, present, and future, and this anti-racist legacy certainly still has significance today. Thank you.
We can silently applaud. Thank you very much for that micro lecture. It's so rich and there's a lot to think about. And I wanted to also thank the speakers, by the way, for joining us from the United States very early in the morning. In New Mexico when we started, it was 8 a.m. And I really appreciate the two who moved mountains to be together with us. So there's another reason, not just for the intellectual content, but for this commitment to come in and talk with us, for which we have gratitude. I also want to take this moment in between the speakers to thank two people behind the scenes, Verena and Aaron, who are working on the Zoom mechanics. And I also mentioned that as we said in the emails before, that the talks and the discussions between the presenters are recorded, but the Q&A will not be recorded. So please do feel welcome to express yourselves as openly as you would like. Next, I am equally honored to present our next speaker. Dr. Yolonda Wilson is an associate professor in the philosophy department at Howard University, who has research interests in bioethics, social and political philosophy, race theory, and feminist philosophy. Professor Wilson also has a connection to Germany, not as a German scholar, but through a German cousin. That is her story to tell, but it reminds us of the texture of Black German diaspora that relates to the broader context that was mentioned by the previous speaker. Professor Wilson earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has also held positions at Duke University, and has been a visiting scholar at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And recently, she is a fellow at the National Humanities Center and is also a recent Encore Public Voices Fellow. her work on issues like bioethics, race, and gender definitely straddle academia and the public sphere. And you can find her public scholarship in venues like the Hastings Center's Bioethics Forum, The Conversation, and other outlets like the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, Salon.com, and the Philly Voice. Her recent article in the American Journal of Bioethics, Intersectionality in Clinical Medicine, the Need for a Conceptual Framework, gives a nice example of Wilson's work as it considers how to apply the intellectual approach of intersectionality, which is a word we've heard a lot about recently, which analyzes the interlocking of race, gender, and other social identities in order to recognize oppression in the clinical environment. And I was quite struck in reading this by the passage that goes as such. Rather than pretending that differences do not exist or minimizing their potential impact on the patient-clinician relationship, intersectionality acknowledges how multifaceted differences shape the patient-clinician interaction and forces a reframing that can lead to improved outcomes. So there's a lot to chew on in that passage, and Professor Wilson stresses that this approach of intersectionality is not just about the business of noting areas of marginalization. These identities manifest and impact in clinical interactions, and they impact clinical interactions, which also sometimes produce disadvantage, just when you're trying to avoid it. So if you look through her publications on the Internet Library Corner, it's another plug for the library, you'll see that her work is very much connected to the question of how to do the right thing. It's a really simple question. How do we do the right thing? And this comes up even more so right now when we can't come together and make up for various rituals. And in particular, as is going to be discussed, rituals that are pertinent in the face of loss. So Professor Wilson is going to be talking to us about a feminist bioethic of grief. And this draws upon her monograph in progress, Black Death, Racial Justice, Priority Setting and Care at the End of Life. And this focuses on end-of-life care in the context of historic and continuing racial injustice leading to African Americans who are unfairly burdened with ill health. And in particular, she's going to connect this book to COVID-19. And we'll get to hear more about the question of what does it mean to feel another's pain? Like, what is that notion of saying, I feel your pain? And how do communities work through grief when the usual cultural mechanisms are not available to us? So thank you very much, Yolanda.
Let me unmute myself. That would actually help a great deal. So first, let me just echo my co-panelist and just thank you all for the invitation, for being so gracious, for being willing to hear what little old me has to say about some stuff. And this is really an honor. I'm very excited to be here. And so I want to say, let me set my timer because sometimes I'll ramble a bit and I want to stop right at 20 minutes. I do want to say, I was kind of thinking through what I would talk about here. And I think, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about grief and empathy. A paper I have coming out in some journal, I can't remember which one, soon, is about empathy and feeling another one's pain. And I've been working on that a bit. And I think it's just feeling a little heavy for me. So I'll come to that at the end, and I'll certainly think we can talk about that during discussion. But I think I want to talk a little bit about something that feels a little less immediately heavy. And part of the heaviness probably comes because I can't avoid reading the news in the US and particularly kind of scrolling through Twitter. And, I read this piece in Wired that came out over the weekend that's comparing kind of the US response with responses in other parts of the world. And it just kind of is adding to, I think, the distress. And as we know, the numbers of those who are impacted, who have died, are disproportionate. And so we'll talk about COVID a little bit. I want to talk about the way that the kind of public response or the federal response to COVID, at least in the US, has contributed to and has heightened inequality. And I want to look at that through the lens of social roles. Now, I do have a connection to Germany. Actually, I come from a military family in the US, and we can talk about the complications there. You may know or may not know that at least in the US, African Americans disproportionately enlist in the US, that because of the way that society is structured and kind of history of structural racism, that for generations entering the military has been kind of a path to, if not middle class, at least a kind of comfortable working class existence. And so, that is my family story. And so I do have several cousins who were actually born in Germany, but the cousin that Lisa refers to is actually German. He was the child of, we assume, a GI and a German woman, and he was adopted into our family as a small child. And so, his first language was German. He thinks of, for a while, I'm sure he thought of himself as German. I don't think that he has that identity as strongly now. We haven't talked about that. So when I was giving this talk here, I said, oh my gosh, I've got to, reach out to him and mention that I'm doing this. And so I would be curious, particularly given Professor Florvil's work, to just have that conversation with him that we've never had about, do you still think of yourself as German? And if so, how? And kind of how do you think of yourself as having a kind of Black German identity? But anyway, to get to my talk, I want to talk a little bit about kind of ethics of care. And so I have a chapter in the book that I'm working on caregiving and the ethic of care. And it's called, I think, Race, Gender, Class, and Caregiving. But I want to think about how a kind of public health response, public health messaging response can or should be guided by an ethic of care and why that matters. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, I want to think about this from the lens of social role. So here we go. In the early days of COVID-19, it was not unusual to hear public officials in the US suggest that we are going to get through this together. So when it became clear that that COVID-19 was going to hit the US hard, scholars in public health, epidemiology, medical sociology, and the like, and others who work broadly on race, racism, and racial health disparities were very interested in how the numbers were shaking out in terms of who was contracting the virus, who was getting the sickest, and who was dying. Anecdotally, it seemed that Black and Brown communities were being disproportionately impacted, but it was important to have actual numbers for lots of reasons, including research and public health interventions such as vaccine development, other resource allocation, and contact tracing. And we know that vaccine development has come into the news a lot. I've been kind of talking and thinking a bit about ethics of vaccine development. And so I think it will be really interesting to get a more international perspective. And I'd love to have a conversation about that during the Q&A. But additionally, information's about which communities are hit hardest and why that could be important for long-range planning, such as public funding for hospitals and clinics. That matters. So it's important to get clear about the numbers. And so this little piece that I'm kind of reading and going through now is going to appear in a longer form in, I think, the University of Toronto Center for Ethics space or journal. So despite states' early reluctance to release data on the racial demographics of those stricken by COVID-19, a curious thing happened once the numbers started coming in. The numbers confirmed that Black people were getting sick and dying from COVID-19 at disproportionate rates. But actually, this wasn't curious to those of us who think about race and racism and health disparities. Actually, a lot of people predicted that this would be the case because the same historical and continuing injustices that created and contribute to disparities in health status and health care also created the conditions for racial differences in who was going to be directly impacted by COVID. And so as the numbers confirm the speculation, those who were Black and or Latinx and later Native American were disproportionately affected, the public response, particularly among whites, began to shift. As I've said elsewhere, the language of crisis began to be replaced with the language of personal responsibility. But the language of personal responsibility is itself often bound up with racist assumptions about who needs to be more responsible. It turns out, and there's some interesting kind of social science literature around this, that white Americans in particular love messages about personal responsibility when those messages are directed at Black people, right? So, right. So if there's an opportunity to say, Black people just need to be more responsible, then those are the messages that white Americans respond favorably to. So a conversation about public health broadly, right, in the public health crisis, became a judgment about morality and irresponsibility, especially with regard to Black people's behavior and health status. Even the U.S. Surgeon General, right, invoked the personal responsibility narrative, admonishing Black and brown people to avoid tobacco, alcohol, and drugs in order to stem the spread of the pandemic. And we know, at least in the US, that Black and brown people don't use drugs any more than white people do. But for some reason, that becomes the stereotype that folks lean into. Yet Adams, who's the U.S. Surgeon General again, did not address any of the social determinants of health, including structural racism. Instead, Adams made vague references to social ills and saying that Black and brown people were socially predisposed to the virus. So the idea that we were in a public health crisis together was suddenly peppered with a litany of ways that Black people needed to behave better, from staying home more, despite the fact that Black people are more likely to be deemed essential workers and without the luxury of working from home. I know when I talk to scholars in Europe, even though they know intellectually what it looks like to be in the US, among the things, aside from our screwed up healthcare system, is this idea of kind of, not having a social safety net that people just have a hard time wrapping their heads around. But so the idea of staying home more, and also speculation about whether the so-called colored population, and this came from a US congressperson, washes their hands properly. In other words, we were all in this together, but only if Black people act right. So what I'm interested in, at least in this piece, is the idea of the public we, and what that has to do with COVID-19 and race. So with the realization that Black, Latinx, and Native American people and communities have been disproportionately hit the hardest, one interpretation that emerged is that COVID-19 revealed and exacerbated the inequities which were already present in society. But the connection between racial inequities and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 could only be a revelation for those who have been blissfully ignorant about how racism has manifested, both in the US and globally, for the last few hundred years. So what we're seeing is a manifestation of the public we, and the fact that this public we doesn't include everyone. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the ancient Greeks had a notion of the polis, right? I mean, many of us on this call are familiar with that. The polis was literally delineated with geographic boundaries that exist within the city-state. It's where the business of governing happens, where the deliberation about the public good happens. And this is where public obligations to one another are hashed out. But the Greeks are very clear. The mere fact of being a human being who lived, worked, or otherwise moved or existed within the geographic confines of the city-state did not necessarily make one a member of the polis. So in addition to the clear geographic boundaries, the polis also contains sociocultural boundaries. And some example of people who are in but not of the polis are those who are women and or slaves. So the deliberations, obligations, and privileges that are negotiated within the polis among its members only included considerations of others insofar as what happened to the others affected the lives, privileges, and habitus of the polis. And from this standpoint, it is less surprising that we have certain obligations to one another becomes folks need to take responsibility for themselves once the numbers are revealed, who was disproportionately sick and who died. And so I want to shift a little bit over to talking about how social roles partly played an important space in who disproportionately gets sick and who dies. And that I want to think about particularly caregiving, and that any kind of justice claim we're going to make about rectifying something like COVID or health disparities broadly or other forms of injustice, including racial injustice, have to take into have to take into consideration the role of caregiving and the ways that we're differently socially situated. So I want to focus on Black women because the racial and gendered wealth gap in the US means that Black women are less likely to have a financial cushion, which makes the immediate cost and long-term consequences of the kinds of caregiving roles that we're likely to occupy even higher. Additionally, it's the case that, and I think this is the case globally, that women are likely to engage in more unpaid caregiving within the family and within the home. And so you have in the circumstance with Black women engaging in kind of lower status, lower paid caregiving within healthcare context. So not as doctors and nurses, but as nurses' aides, for example. And also within the home, because of the way that caregiving is gendered, engaging in disproportionate amounts of unpaid caregiving that require women broadly and Black women in particular to exit or scale back from the workforce. And so why does this matter? So given a US wealth gap that is both raced and gendered, Black women bear a significant financial burden for unpaid caregiving within families and disproportionately occupy the ranks of low paid, low status, physically demanding caregivers in the workforce, in the labor force. And the physically demanding part, I don't think that gets enough uptake, just how hard it is, particularly among the kind of lower status, lower paid caregiving work, that a lot of that involves, physically lifting patients, moving patients, and the consequences that has on the body, particularly in a place like the US where engaging in that kind of work damages the body, but then there's not much recourse in terms of getting healthcare for oneself. So as of 2018, Black women on average earn 61.8 cents for every dollar that a white man earns, right? So that's going to be important. So when you control for class, when you control for education, that's what that looks like. As US boomers age, the numbers of adults needing care has grown and will continue to grow. Additionally, millions of adults who are not aged need some measure of assistance with activities of daily living due to chronic illness and/or disability. Women of color generally, many of whom are immigrants, perform a disproportionate amount of this labor. Additionally, households of color are more likely to have elder care responsibilities, given that we are more likely to live in multi-generational households. Now, to kind of go back specifically to the COVID circumstance and where we find ourselves, especially in the US, what we find is that precisely the multi-generational living is what makes spread so dangerous, but it's also one of the things that makes Black and brown populations much more vulnerable to COVID. So you have these factors converging of housing discrimination coming into play, and in some senses, maybe there are kind of cultural sensibilities around living multi-generationally, but there are also the financial reality, given the cost of housing, given the kinds of employment available, that multi-generational living becomes part and parcel of what it means to just survive in the US. So I just want to kind of skip over to think more specifically about the ethic of care. So we've talked about social roles, we've talked kind of about the public we in COVID. So some of the ethics of care literature that you see are historically, certainly starting with Carol Gilligan, there's this idea of women as just naturally or inherently having certain sensibilities around care and caregiving. And so I reject this aspect of an ethic of care as a uniquely feminine approach to thinking and its tendency to embrace a certain kind of essentialism about gender. I do reject that. However, I think that an ethic of care can and should help us inform our social reality. So what do I mean by an ethic of care? Well, two things, just in the interest of time. One, I think that justice, right? Part of an ethic of care means that part of justice means caring for others, right? Rather than thinking about this kind of naked individualism and autonomy, that caring for others has to be part of one's conception of justice. And two, that interconnectedness is an inherently valuable principle of inquiry, right? It's inherently valuable, but it's also an organizing principle of inquiry. So in that regard, as I've said elsewhere, I think I was quoted in a piece in the Atlantic or something, there's no dilemma between science and ethics, right? It's not kind of be scientific or be ethical. But in my mind, the science should be driven by ethics, right? In this instance, I'm advocating for philosophically for an ethics of care. But I'll say a couple of things because I know time is drawing near and we want to get to conversation. One of the major lapses in US COVID policy, and there are many, I know, too many to count actually. But one of the major lapses is the lack of consideration for those who are deemed essential workers. And the fact that those who are deemed essential workers are largely engaged in forms of care work, right? So this ethic of care thinks about caring for others as kind of a principle of justice, as an organizing principle. But I'm also kind of, even though I'm using the same language, I want to disentangle that from care work. And we can kind of hash out this distinction a little bit in conversation. But those who have been deemed essential workers are largely engaged in care work, right? From healthcare to the hospitality industry to retail, and even the kind of, what are they calling themselves, or what are they being forced to call themselves in the US? Independent contractors like Uber and Instacart who are delivering groceries, right? So in the conversation about the COVID policy, how do people who must be out and about keep safe, right? And what obligations, not just suggestions, but I think moral obligations, do those who are not essential workers have toward those who are? So even in the midst of rising case numbers in the US and elsewhere, in some areas of the country, leaders are doubling down on personal responsibility messaging. And we can also talk about, you know, as I said in my kind of brief discussion of social roles, who the essential workers are. And I don't think you can disentangle that from the kind of personal responsibility messaging. Finally, and I'd be incredibly interested in hearing how things are in Germany, I am concerned about an ethic of care with regard to those who are dying and who have died from COVID. So the US standard has been in general to isolate COVID patients, right? Just totally by, no visitors, minimal contact with healthcare workers, resulting in thousands of people dying alone. And so I'm from a very rural part of the US. And in my instance, right, there's one hospital in town, and there were people I knew who died hours away from home alone. So it's not even like, you know that at least your Reddit family is across town, even if you can't see them. So to think about this from a perspective of human interconnectedness, there are significant ripple effects on human interaction. The trauma for those left behind, knowing that their loved one died all alone. Also, many hospitals have curtailed visitation for all patients in hospital, which means that many patients are alone at a time when they're frightened and vulnerable. And so what do death and dying rituals look like under these conditions? In the US, we've had a lot of Zoom funerals or just haven't had any sort of ceremony at all. Of course, right, controlling spread has to be of the utmost importance. At the same time, these other considerations can guide deliberation about how best to do that. If you start from the standpoint of how and why care for others is a matter of justice, and that interconnectedness is an important human value, then the decision procedures that follow must look different than simply isolating everyone or telling people to be personally responsible. And I'll stop right here so that we can kind of, there's my timer anyway. My timing's perfect, right? So that we can engage in conversation with one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much.